The heart of Chicago pulsed with an energy all its own. Beneath the glistening skyscrapers and the hum of the city's perpetual motion, the Charlene Tower stood as a testament to luxury and power. Its sleek glass windows captured the city's skyline, with breathtaking precision reflecting the endless stream of lives that passed beneath it. Inside the world was one of opulence and quiet elegance, where every inch of the polished marble floors spoke of a history filled with wealth, legacy, and grandeur. For Clara Johnson, standing behind the front desk of the Charlene Towers lobby, the world she had entered seemed both like a dream and a cruel reminder of everything she had yet to achieve. The lobby was a blend of modern sophistication and classic charm, gleaming chandeliers that hung like clusters of diamonds, plush velvet sofas that whispered of comfort, and guests who spoke in tones of both reverence and expectation. Clara's fingers brushed against the polished wood of the front desk, the smoothness of the surface offering her a brief respite from the quiet turmoil brewing inside. She had come from nothing. Raised in a small apartment on Chicago's South Side, her life had been a constant battle against the weight of expectations, both from the world around her and the relentless voice in her head that asked, "Do you belong here?" She adjusted the delicate silver bracelet on her wrist, the only piece of jewelry she could afford. It felt like a fragile link to the world she had yet to conquer, a reminder that she wasn't here by accident. She had earned this moment with every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every dollar saved. But as the golden doors of the lobby swung open, a wave of uncertainty washed over her, threatening to pull her under. "Good evening, Miss Johnson," a voice interrupted her thoughts. Turning, Clara saw the night manager, an older gentleman named Mr. Harrington, offering her a nod of approval. She smiled back, her lips curving into a mask of politeness, the smile that had become second nature after countless hours spent perfecting her professionalism. "Thank you, Mr. Harrington," she replied, trying her best to keep the fluttering in her chest from showing. She had always been good at hiding what she truly felt. In a world that placed so much value on appearances, it was the one thing she could control. Her uniform, perfectly pressed, clung to her like a second skin, and the weight of her responsibilities felt heavier with each passing moment. She was the first point of contact for the elite of Chicago, the ones who walked into this hotel like they owned the city, like it was made just for them. But today it was different. The air felt thicker, and the shimmer of gold on the chandeliers seemed to burn brighter than usual. There was something in the air tonight, something that shifted with the arrival of a guest who would change everything. A man entered, tall and commanding. His presence filled the room before he even spoke. His suit, dark and impeccably tailored, hung on his frame like it had been crafted just for him. His dark hair, slightly tousled, added a touch of mystery to his otherwise perfect appearance. Clara's gaze lifted instinctively, caught by the kind of elegance that even in this world felt rare and fleeting. For a moment she froze, not because she was starstruck, though the man was undeniably attractive, but because of the sheer aura of confidence he carried with him. He was in every sense of the word untouchable, and Clara knew deep down that he was part of this world, the world that she was trying so hard to be a part of, but never quite feeling like she truly belonged. His eyes met hers across the vast expanse of the lobby, and for the briefest moment their gazes locked. There was no immediate recognition in his look, just the passing glance of a man who saw the world through a different lens. A lens that didn't require approval or permission, or even acknowledgement of the small players around him. He was a king in his own realm, and she was nothing more than the castle's gatekeeper. "Good evening, Sir Clara," said her voice steady despite the strange tightness in her throat. Her training took over, and the professional smile was back in place, a mask she wore well. He stepped closer, his stride long and purposeful. For a moment, Clara's heart skipped a beat. It was foolish, she knew, to be affected by a simple look, but the power of his presence stirred something deep inside her, something she had learned to suppress over the years. "I'll just need to check in," he said, his voice smooth like the sound of velvet against skin. There was something oddly familiar in the way he spoke, something that made Clara wonder if she should know him. But before she could give it any more thought, she stood up straighter, her professional instincts kicking in. "Of course, sir," she replied, reaching for the guest registration. As she did so, he looked at her more closely, really looked at her. His eyes, dark and intense, studied her in a way that made her feel exposed. And just like that, in the midst of all the grandeur of the hotel and the luxury surrounding them, Clara felt a shift. The uncertainty that had plagued her since her first day on the job suddenly seemed distant. She was no longer just a girl from the wrong side of the tracks. For a moment in this man's gaze, she could almost believe she was worthy of being here. "Clara Johnson," he said, his voice soft but sharp enough to catch her attention. "You're the one they've been talking about, aren't you?" Her breath caught in her throat. She blinked, trying to mask the surprise. "I beg your pardon." He smiled slightly, a knowing glint in his eyes. "The new star on the team. They say you're the one to watch." She felt a flush creep up her neck, unsure whether it was flattery or embarrassment that made her cheeks heat. Still, she maintained her composure, setting the registration book down and focusing on the task at hand. "Well, thank you for the compliment, sir. I'll make sure your check-in is quick and seamless." As she typed the information into the system, she couldn't help but feel the weight of his gaze on her. It wasn't just the weight of a guest who expected impeccable service. No, it was the weight of someone who saw her not just as an employee, but as a person. For the briefest of moments, she wondered if this man saw the same thing she saw in him, a world so far removed from her own that it seemed impossible to bridge the gap. And yet in that fleeting second, the lines blurred. She wasn't sure if she wanted to escape his presence or draw closer to it. But she didn't have time for that. As he signed the guest book and handed over his ID, she met his gaze once more. And this time, she didn't look away. "Welcome to the Charlene Tower, Mr. Carter." Clara said, her voice low and steady. "I hope your stay is nothing short of spectacular." He smiled genuinely with a warmth that contradicted the coldness of the world they both occupied. "I'm sure it will be." As he turned to walk away, Clara stood still for a moment, the silence of the lobby suddenly too loud in her ears. She hadn't noticed before, but the world outside seemed to have changed. The city lights shimmered more brightly now. The air felt warmer. In the space of a few seconds, everything had shifted. If you've enjoyed Clara's journey so far, don't forget to like, comment, and follow us for more of her story. This is just the beginning of something unforgettable, so stay with us as we dive deeper into the heart of Chicago and the lives that change it forever. The night had settled over Chicago like a velvet cloak, rich and dark, with the promise of quiet secrets hidden in every corner of the city. In the heart of the Charlene Tower, the lobby shimmered under the soft glow of chandeliers, casting intricate patterns of light across the marble floor. The sounds of hushed conversations, the clink of glasses, and the soft shuffle of footsteps created a quiet symphony of elegance. Clara Johnson had always loved the stillness of the night, especially when the hotel seemed to breathe in sync with her own pulse. The guests had drifted away to their rooms, leaving the lobby in a peaceful quiet, broken only by the distant hum of the city streets below. The relief of the evening's lull had settled over her like a comforting blanket, and for the first time in hours, Clara allowed herself to breathe deeply, to let her shoulders relax and her mind drift from the responsibilities of the day. It was in these quiet moments that Clara often wondered if she would ever truly belong in a world like this. Her hands, which moved gracefully across the guest records, trembled slightly as the weight of her thoughts bore down on her. She had always dreamed of this, a life of purpose and opportunity, but the reality, with its polished surfaces and wealth beyond measure, often felt like a world she was only allowed to observe from the outside. Her reverie was broken by the soft swish of the revolving doors. Clara's gaze flicked up instinctively, expecting another late check-in, or perhaps a few stragglers returning from the evening's events. What she didn't expect was the man who entered, bringing with him an aura of presence that filled the room long before she could make out his features. He was tall, strikingly so, and though his dark suit was tailored to perfection, it wasn't his attire that caught her attention. It was the way he moved with a fluid grace that suggested he was more than just a man passing through. There was something about him, something that commanded the attention of everyone in the room, as though the space had been made for him alone. Clara found herself still, her fingers frozen on the keyboard of her terminal. She didn't want to stare, but she couldn't help herself. The man's presence was magnetic, drawn not just from his wealth, though his polished appearance spoke of it in volumes, but from an unspoken depth in his gaze. His eyes, dark and intense, swept the room in a way that suggested he was used to taking in his surroundings, not just observing them, but claiming them. When his gaze landed on hers, Clara's breath caught, as though the air had suddenly thickened around them. She didn't know why, but in that moment the world felt a little smaller. The opulent lobby, the distant hum of the city, and even the quiet buzz of the other guests, all of it seemed to fade away as his attention locked onto hers. "Good evening," he said, his voice deep and smooth, rich with a quiet authority that sent a flutter through Clara's chest. It wasn't the tone of a man who expected to be treated with awe, though he undoubtedly was, but one of simple recognition, as though the very act of addressing her was a form of acknowledgement, a recognition of their shared space. "Good evening," Clara replied, her voice steady, though the tightness in her chest betrayed her calm exterior. She forced a smile, the practiced one she had perfected over weeks of serving the guests of this high-end hotel. Her hand moved to the register, and she began to type, though her mind was far from the task at hand. "I'm checking in." He continued, his words simple, but there was a weight to them, a deliberate pause before he added Daniel Carter. The name struck her like a bolt of lightning. Daniel Carter. The Daniel Carter. The owner of the Charlene Tower. The name that had been whispered in the halls, admired by the staff, and known across the city. Her hands stilled, and for a moment Clara couldn't believe her ears. This was no ordinary guest. This was the man who owned the hotel, the man whose decisions shaped the very world in which she had spent the last few weeks attempting to find her place. His eyes studied her with a quiet curiosity, and for a fleeting moment Clara wondered if he had noticed the slight shock in her expression. Her mind raced, her professionalism kicked in, and she forced herself to meet his gaze once more, masking her surprise behind a veil of composure. "Of course, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice softer now but still measured. "I'll prepare your room immediately." He nodded, though his gaze lingered on her a little longer than necessary, as if weighing something in her expression. It wasn't an uncomfortable look, but one that seemed to say he saw more than just the polite front she presented. Clara found herself standing a little straighter, as though the weight of his gaze had some kind of effect on her, though she couldn't explain why. As she prepared his check-in information, the seconds stretched on, though they felt like hours. His presence filled the room, creating an almost tangible energy that seemed to hum in the air around her. She moved with precision, her fingers flying across the keyboard, though every movement felt like it was in sync with the rhythm of his steady breathing. When she finally handed him the key card, she couldn't help but glance at him once more, her breath caught in her throat. The moment felt suspended, like the pause before the first drop of rain hits the earth. There was a quiet understanding between them, now something that hadn't existed before his entrance into the lobby. Something that seemed to transcend the usual roles of guest and employee. "Thank you," he said again, his voice quieter now, but still rich with that quiet intensity that had marked their first exchange. "I'm sure it will be a pleasant stay." Clara nodded, a soft smile playing at the corners of her lips. "I'm certain it will be, Mr. Carter. Enjoy your time at the Charlene Tower." He turned, walking away with the same purposeful stride, his presence a silent weight in the air, as though the entire room had been altered by his passing. Clara watched him for a moment longer, the feeling of his gaze lingering on her skin like the softest caress before he disappeared into the elevator. She took a slow breath, as though the air in the room had just returned to its normal state. The lobby was quiet again, but now it felt different. The shimmer of the chandeliers seemed brighter, the echoes of footsteps lighter. And Clara felt something stir within her, something she couldn't name, but knew was there, growing in the silence of that moment. As the elevator doors closed with a soft ding, Clara took another breath and turned back to her duties. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the world had shifted ever so slightly with the arrival of Daniel Carter. She wasn't sure what that shift meant yet, but she knew it was a beginning. The following days passed in a blur of glittering events, fleeting moments, and whispered rumors, but Clara couldn't shake the memory of Daniel Carter. It was as if he had left an imprint on the very fabric of the Charlene Tower, an undeniable presence that clung to the polished surfaces of the hotel's marble floors, lingered in the crisp air of its halls, and echoed in the quiet spaces where only the hum of the city could be heard. He had walked into her life like a storm, powerful and untamed, leaving Clara with a sense of disquiet she hadn't expected. Each time she moved through the hotel's lobby, she half expected to see him again. And when she did, it was always from afar, always just enough to make her wonder if he was aware of the strange connection she felt in his presence. But he never looked her way. Daniel Carter was a man of power, and Clara was just the night shift supervisor, a small player in the vast world he inhabited. It was a late Thursday evening when Clara saw him again, standing near the grand staircase, speaking with a group of executives from a Fortune 500 company that had booked an event at the hotel. His suit, the same deep charcoal she had seen him wear the first time they met, seemed to radiate power. His every movement, deliberate and smooth, carried the weight of authority. Yet there was something else there, something intangible that only someone who truly observed could see. Clara found herself watching him from behind the front desk, though she immediately chastised herself for doing so. She had to remind herself that she was here to work to create an atmosphere of comfort for the guests, not to indulge in fantasies about men who would never see her as more than an employee. She was a professional, and that was all she could afford to be. But the truth was, Daniel Carter was different. There was something about him that wasn't simply the polished exterior of a billionaire. It wasn't his wealth that held her attention. It was the quiet strength in the way he moved, the calm intensity that settled around him like a cloak. There was a power that came with that kind of stillness, that ability to command the room with nothing but his presence. It intrigued her more than she cared to admit. As the group of executives moved past the front desk, Clara straightened in her chair, her focus shifting back to the task at hand. But then, as if the universe had conspired to force her to acknowledge him, Daniel Carter turned and for the briefest of moments caught her eye. It was a gaze that held weight like a magnet, pulling her in even as she tried to look away. And then, to her surprise, he began walking toward her. Clara's heart leapt in her chest, a flutter of nervousness skittering through her veins. She quickly stood, smoothing the hem of her uniform, trying to compose herself. The last thing she needed was to appear flustered in front of him. But no matter how hard she tried, there was no denying the way his presence made her feel. He stopped in front of the desk, the faintest of smiles playing at the corners of his lips as he regarded her with a curiosity that seemed to deepen with every passing second. "Clara," he said, his voice low and smooth, a hint of something unspoken lingering in the air between them. "How are you this evening?" His tone was warm, but there was an edge to it, a sense that he wasn't merely exchanging pleasantries. His eyes held hers with an intensity that made it impossible for her to look away. "I'm doing well, thank you," Clara replied, her voice steady, but betraying the flutter of her heart. She couldn't help but notice the way his gaze seemed to pierce right through her, reading her in a way that no one else had ever done. It was unsettling, yet somehow comforting. "I hope everything has been to your liking," she added, her professional instincts kicking in. She had to maintain her composure, no matter how much he unsettled her. He nodded slowly, the faintest smile still on his lips. "The hotel is impeccable as always. You've created a remarkable atmosphere here, Clara." Her breath caught in her throat. A compliment from Daniel Carter was not something she had expected, and yet it felt like a victory of sorts. The way he spoke so effortlessly, so genuinely, it made her question whether he truly saw her as just another staff member, or if perhaps he noticed something more beneath the surface. "Thank you, Mr. Carter," Clara said softly, her heart racing as she struggled to maintain control. "It's my pleasure." There was a long pause, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The air between them seemed thick with something unspoken, something neither could name. And then in the stillness of that moment, Daniel leaned slightly forward, his voice lowering to a near whisper. "You know," he began, his gaze never leaving hers, "I've been thinking about our first meeting. I can't say I've ever been treated quite like that before." Clara's breath faltered, the memory of their first encounter flashing before her. How she had dismissed him coldly, without recognizing who he truly was, without giving him the respect he so clearly commanded. She had acted out of instinct, a mix of professionalism and defensiveness. But now standing in front of him, she couldn't help but feel the weight of her actions. "I didn't mean to be disrespectful," Clara replied, her voice soft, a hint of regret in her words. She couldn't quite meet his gaze, unsure of how to explain the distance she had put between them on that first night. "I was just focused on my job." Daniel's eyes softened, and to Clara's surprise, a small chuckle escaped him. "I know. I admire your dedication, Clara. But I also know that it's not often a person gets to be themselves in a world like this." He paused, his gaze deepening, like he was seeing something in her that she wasn't even aware of. "I respect that about you." Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words, though she quickly suppressed it, unsure how to respond. What was it about him that made her feel both powerful and vulnerable at once? "You seem different," she said before she could stop herself. Her words hung in the air between them, both an observation and a question. "Different from the others." Daniel's smile deepened, though it was tempered with something that almost resembled amusement. "I suppose I am," he replied. "I don't quite fit the mold, do I?" "No," Clara said, a soft laugh escaping her before she could help it. "You don't." For a moment the silence between them stretched thick and heavy before he spoke again, his tone no longer light but laced with something more serious. "Clara, I don't usually make a habit of this, but I find myself wanting to know more about you." His voice was steady, but Clara could hear the subtle undercurrent of sincerity. "Not as an employee of the hotel, but as a person. There's something about you, something I can't quite explain." She swallowed hard, her mind racing. The very air between them seemed to crackle with energy. She wanted to step back, to return to the safety of professional distance, but something inside her held her rooted to the spot. The pull between them was undeniable. "I don't know what to say," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel's eyes softened again, and for the briefest of moments Clara saw something in them, something that wasn't cold or calculating, but raw, open, and vulnerable. "You don't have to say anything," he replied quietly. "But I think we both know there's something here, something that goes beyond what we've built with just words." And for the first time, Clara realized that this moment wasn't just about power, it was about connection. Something deeper than the roles they played, something that neither of them had expected to find in the cold, polished halls of the Charlene Tower. She didn't know where this would lead, but one thing was certain: everything had changed. The days that followed Daniel's unexpected admission lingered in Clara's thoughts like an unspoken promise, tantalizing and elusive. She tried to dismiss the weight of his words, bearing them beneath the careful structure of her daily routine at the Charlene Tower. But no matter how hard she tried to focus on her work, the memory of his gaze, the intensity of it, the way it seemed to pierce through the polished facade she wore, haunted her. Clara had lived her life carefully guarding her emotions with a fierce determination, and yet in that brief exchange, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: vulnerability. She found herself thinking of him during her late-night shifts, when the hotel's grand lobby became a shadow of its usual self, and the hum of the city outside seemed far away. She couldn't help but wonder what it was about Daniel Carter that made him stand out so dramatically from the other powerful men who walked through the hotel's doors. He was different. He wasn't just another guest who had the world at his feet. There was something far more complex, more enigmatic about him. Despite her best efforts, their paths crossed again, and each time it felt like a collision of two worlds: his, of wealth and influence, and hers, of humility and quiet ambition. And each time Clara felt the friction between those worlds grow. The moments they shared were like delicate threads, fragile and fleeting, yet somehow laden with significance. It was a Friday evening when their worlds collided with full force. Clara was behind the desk, her fingers moving deftly across the keyboard, when she saw him again. Daniel was entering the lobby this time, accompanied by a group of corporate partners, sharp-suited men and women, all carrying the air of self-assurance that came with success. Clara's heart skipped a beat, And before she could stop herself, she stood straighter, instinctively, drawing attention to herself as she prepared for yet another brief encounter. This time, however, there was something different. Daniel didn't walk past the desk as he usually did. Instead, he slowed his pace, his gaze landing on her with an almost imperceptible intensity. The others in his group continued on, but Daniel lingered. The briefest of moments stretched between them, and Clara felt the familiar pull, the attraction she had tried so hard to ignore. He took a step toward her, and Clara's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't prepared for this, wasn't prepared for the way her pulse quickened at the simple act of him approaching her. It was a dangerous feeling, one that threatened to pull her in deeper than she was willing to go. Clara Daniel greeted her, his voice warm, but with an underlying weight she couldn't quite place. "I didn't expect to see you tonight. How's everything going?" Clara gave him a polite smile, her mind struggling to maintain its usual composure. "Everything is running smoothly, Mr. Carter," she replied, keeping her voice steady despite the flutter of nerves inside. She focused on the task at hand, forcing herself to glance at the computer screen as though it would somehow steady her racing thoughts. Daniel nodded, but his gaze didn't shift from her face. "You know, I was just telling my colleagues how impressive you are, how well you've managed things here." His words were uncharacteristically genuine, and Clara felt a warm flush spread across her chest at the compliment. It was the kind of praise that made her feel seen, not as just another hotel staff member, but as an individual. A rare thing in a world that constantly seemed to categorize people by their status. Before she could respond, the group of executives called to Daniel, their voices snapping him back to the present, but not before a final glance passed between him and Clara. She wasn't sure what it was, whether it was the warmth in his eyes or the way the air between them seemed charged with something unspoken, but she felt a shiver run through her, and for a moment the noise of the hotel faded. "Enjoy the rest of your evening," Daniel said with a smile, the words light but the weight behind them unmistakable. Clara nodded, her lips curving into a small polite smile. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. You as well." As he turned to join his colleagues, Clara felt a strange sense of emptiness settle in her chest. She had always known the boundaries of her world, had always kept them firmly in place, telling herself that she could never step beyond them. And yet in Daniel's gaze, she had seen the very thing she had spent so many years pushing away, the desire to be something more. To be seen, truly seen, not just for her role at the hotel, but for the person she was beneath the surface. She quickly forced the thought from her mind, taking a deep breath as she refocused on the task at hand. But as the night wore on, her mind wandered back to him, back to the man who had set her world spinning with nothing more than a few words and a look. It wasn't long before their worlds collided once again. This time it was during a gala event that had been booked in the hotel's grand ballroom. Clara had been tasked with overseeing the event's logistics, ensuring that every detail was perfect for the high-profile guests. The night was bustling with energy, shimmering gowns, tuxedos, and the sound of laughter and clinking glasses filled the air. Yet amidst all the glamour, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. And then, as if summoned by her thoughts, Daniel appeared. He entered the ballroom with a commanding presence, as if the entire room had been designed to bow to him. His tall, broad frame moved through the crowd with ease, his eyes scanning the room with the practiced focus of someone used to being in control. Clara watched him from the edge of the room, her pulse quickening as he moved with such effortless grace. For a moment their eyes met across the room, and Clara felt the familiar tension return, that invisible force between them that seemed to draw them closer, even as they stood on opposite sides of the room. She quickly looked away, but the sensation of his gaze lingered like the heat of a fire on her skin. She busied herself with her duties, but her mind kept drifting back to him. The way he moved through the crowd, the effortless power he exuded, it was all so foreign to her. Clara had spent so long fighting for her place in a world that seemed to ignore her existence. Daniel, on the other hand, had been born into this world. It was his birthright, his natural habitat. She wasn't sure what it was about him, his quiet confidence, or the way he made everything around him seem secondary, but it made her feel as though she didn't belong. And then once again their worlds collided. Clara found herself standing near the center of the ballroom, her eyes scanning the crowd for any issues that needed attention when she felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned, and there, standing in front of her, with that same warm, knowing smile, was Daniel. "Clara," he said, his voice low, almost intimate despite the bustling noise of the room. "You look stunning tonight." The compliment took her by surprise, and for a moment she didn't know what to say. Clara had always been the practical type, the one who focused on getting things done, not on appearances. But now, under the glow of the chandeliers, Daniel's words seemed to make her feel more visible than she had ever felt before. "Thank you," she replied softly, her cheeks flushing slightly under the attention. "I've been meaning to speak with you, Daniel," continued, his voice rich with something deeper, something Clara couldn't quite place. "About the other night, I'm afraid I didn't get a chance to properly express my gratitude for the way you handled everything." Clara felt a strange flutter in her chest at the sincerity in his voice. "It's my job," she said, brushing off the praise, but Daniel was quick to shake his head. "No," he said, his gaze intense. "It's more than that. You're different, Clara. You've managed to do something I've rarely seen here." His words lingered in the air between them like a promise that had yet to be fulfilled. Clara felt the pull of it, the strange magnetic connection that neither of them could explain. But in the back of her mind, a warning echoed, telling her that their worlds were too different. She was a woman who had spent her life striving for what little she had, while Daniel had been born into everything she had ever dreamed of. The tension between them was palpable, thick like the humidity before a storm, and Clara knew that this was the moment. The moment when their worlds would finally clash, whether they were ready for it or not. As the sound of music and laughter swirled around them, Clara took a steadying breath, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. The night after the gala felt different. The shimmering chandeliers and polished marble floors of the Charlene Tower seemed to fade into the background, swallowed by the heavy quiet of the evening. The hotel, usually alive with energy, now felt like an empty shell, a space where the echoes of laughter and music had long faded, leaving only the weight of unspoken thoughts. Clara's shift had ended, but as always she lingered. It was a habit she couldn't shake, this need to stay, to make sure everything was just right before she left. It was as if the hotel itself held a part of her, pulling her back every time she tried to step away. Tonight, though, the pull was different. The world outside, with its city lights and chaotic rhythms, seemed to call her, but it wasn't the outside world she was drawn to. It was the space within these walls, the silence of the lobby where she could be alone with her thoughts. Her fingers brushed the edge of the front desk, the familiar coolness of the polished wood grounding her in the stillness. She had avoided Daniel after their conversation earlier in the ballroom, her mind swirling with the implications of his words. "You're different," he had said, and the weight of it had followed her like a shadow ever since. What did he mean by that? And more importantly, why did it matter so much? The truth was, she hadn't expected him to look at her the way he did, to see her, truly see her, beyond the uniform, beyond the role she played. It was a look that stirred something deep within her, a vulnerability she hadn't let herself feel in years. Clara had built walls around herself, walls that kept the world at bay. But with Daniel, those walls seemed to crumble brick by brick until she was left standing in the open, exposed in a way she couldn't comprehend. As she stood there lost in thought, the sound of the revolving doors pulled her back to the present. She glanced up instinctively, her pulse quickening at the sight of him. Daniel. This time he wasn't surrounded by a group of executives or the polished professionals of his world. He was alone, walking through the lobby with a quiet, purposeful stride. His usual air of command was gone, replaced by something softer, something more uncertain. Clara's breath caught in her throat as their eyes met across the room. The same pull she had felt earlier at the gala gripped her once again, more powerful than before. She didn't know what it was about him, but she couldn't deny the way his presence affected her. It was like a storm, a quiet one, but one that she knew would eventually change everything. He stopped in front of the desk, his gaze never leaving hers. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the hotel seemed to fade, as if the world had paused for them to exist in this single fragile moment. Daniel's eyes were intense, but there was something else there now. Something Clara hadn't noticed before, a tenderness, a vulnerability that matched her own. "Clara," he said softly, his voice carrying through the stillness of the room. "I've been thinking about you." Clara's heart skipped a beat, her breath faltering at the simplicity of his words. She wasn't sure why they affected her so deeply, why it felt like they carried more weight than they should. I, I didn't expect to see you here," she said, her voice steady, though she felt anything but. It was a quiet attempt to regain control, to protect herself from the vulnerability that was creeping up on her, threatening to overwhelm her. Daniel took a step closer, his gaze never leaving her face. "I needed to talk to you," he said, his voice low, almost intimate. "There's something I haven't said, something I should have said a long time ago." Clara's heart raced in her chest. What was he going to say? She knew deep down that she should be cautious, that she shouldn't let herself get caught up in the complexity of his world. But there was a pull between them that was undeniable, a magnetic force she couldn't resist. "I'm listening," she said, though her voice trembled slightly, betraying the calm exterior she was trying so hard to maintain. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, a subtle sign of unease that caught Clara off guard. She had seen him exude nothing but confidence and control in the past, but now in this quiet moment between them, he seemed human, vulnerable. She had always thought of him as someone untouchable, someone whose world was far beyond hers. But now, standing before him, she realized how wrong she had been. "I don't know how to say this," Daniel continued, his voice still soft but tinged with uncertainty. "I've been thinking about the way I've treated you, Clara, the way I've treated everyone around me. I've always been so focused on the business, on the next deal, the next step. But in doing that, I've forgotten something important." Clara listened intently, her pulse racing as she watched him struggle to find the right words. There was a quiet honesty in his voice that surprised her, a rawness she hadn't expected from a man who was usually so composed. "You've seen something in me," he said finally, his gaze never wavering. "Something no one else has seen. You've treated me differently, not because of who I am, but because of who you are. And I can't tell you how much that means to me." Clara's heart twisted at the sincerity in his words. She had always been the one to guard herself, to protect her heart from disappointment. But in that moment, something inside her began to shift. She had never allowed herself to be vulnerable, not in the way Daniel was asking her to be. "I didn't mean to treat you differently," Clara whispered, her voice shaking with the vulnerability she had never allowed to surface. "I was just doing my job. But I guess," she paused, unsure of how to finish, "I guess I've always wondered if I'm just one of the many. If I'm just another person you see as a part of your world, your business." Daniel took another step forward, his face softening with understanding. He reached out, placing a hand on the desk in front of her, leaning slightly forward. "You're not just another person, Clara. You never have been." The weight of his words settled heavily in the space between them, and Clara felt something inside her crack. The walls she had so carefully built to protect herself from the world and from him were beginning to crumble. "I've been so focused on the idea of control," Daniel continued, his voice quiet but earnest. "But I've come to realize that some things can't be controlled. Some things are just meant to happen. And meeting you, Clara, is one of those things." Clara felt her breath catch in her throat as the words echoed in her mind. She had spent so long building a life based on structure, on expectations, on rules. But now, standing before Daniel, she realized how much she had shut herself off from everything that truly mattered. A silence passed between them, heavy with everything they had yet to say. Clara didn't know how to respond. She had spent so many years believing that vulnerability was a weakness, that it was something she couldn't afford. But here in this quiet corner of the hotel, surrounded by the walls she had built, she found herself wanting to trust him, wanting to believe that the connection between them was more than just a fleeting moment. "Clara," Daniel said softly, his voice thick with emotion, "I know this is complicated, I know that I come from a world that seems so far removed from yours, but I can't deny what I'm feeling. I can't deny that you've made me see something I've been blind to for a long time." Clara looked up at him, her heart racing as her walls continued to crumble. She had always thought of herself as strong as someone who could keep her heart safe. But in Daniel's eyes and the sincerity of his voice, she saw something different, something real. For the first time in her life, Clara allowed herself to be vulnerable. And in that vulnerability, she saw the possibility of something beautiful. The days following Daniel's revelation were marked by a quiet, almost imperceptible shift between Clara and the world around her. It was as if in his vulnerability, he had unlocked something within her. A door she hadn't known was there, a doorway to something she had spent her entire life keeping shut. She had always been the steady one, the composed one, the one who did everything with precision and order. But now there were moments when her thoughts scattered, when her heart fluttered with a sweetness she couldn't quite understand. Clara's usual routines, those rituals that grounded her in the familiar, began to feel different. The morning meetings, the hurried walks through the hotel's corridors, the check-ins and check-outs, it all seemed more mundane than before, as though the world outside had become less vibrant compared to the space Daniel had occupied in her heart. The most significant change was the shift in her perception of herself. Clara had always known who she was in the world, what she was capable of, but now she wondered, who was she becoming? Her role as a hotel supervisor had defined her for so long, and yet as she looked in the mirror each morning, she saw something new, something she had never allowed herself to see. It was in the quiet moments late at night when the hotel had emptied that Clara felt this transformation most keenly. She would find herself standing before the glass windows of the lobby, watching the city stretch out below her like an ocean of lights. The vastness of it should have been intimidating, but instead it felt like an invitation. The world, she realized, was much bigger than she had ever imagined. And so was she. Her hands would reach up to touch the soft fabric of her uniform, and for the first time she would wonder what it would feel like to wear something else, something more than just a reflection of her duties, something that spoke to the woman she was becoming rather than the woman she had been. The thought was a quiet rebellion, a whisper that urged her to embrace more than just the world of efficiency and service. It wasn't until one afternoon, when Clara's routine was interrupted by an unexpected message, that she realized just how far her world had shifted. She had been in the middle of overseeing a routine event when the phone behind the desk rang. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, but with a note of something almost playful, a warmth that Clara recognized immediately. Clara Daniels' voice came through smooth and reassuring. "I need you to meet me in 20 minutes. Don't ask questions. Just trust me." Her heart skipped, a flutter of excitement running through her as she held the phone to her ear. His tone was casual, but there was something urgent beneath it, something that made her wonder what he was planning. "I'll be there," she said before she could think it through, the decision already made, before she could second-guess it. When the elevator doors opened on the penthouse floor, Clara's breath caught in her throat. She had been here before in passing when events had taken place in the higher levels of the hotel. But today the space felt different, almost like it had been transformed to match the strange shift that had occurred within her. The doors opened to a luxurious suite with sweeping views of the city below. The room was bathed in soft golden light with rich velvet curtains that framed the windows like paintings. But it wasn't the space itself that stole her breath. It was Daniel. He stood by the window, his back to her, his broad shoulders silhouetted by the setting sun. He turned slowly, his eyes locking onto hers with a look that seemed to pierce through the air between them. "I wanted to show you something," he said softly, his voice low with meaning. There was a vulnerability in it, an openness that Clara had come to recognize as his true self. She stepped into the room, the air charged with something she couldn't define. "What is this, Daniel?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you want me here?" Daniel smiled, a small, knowing smile that made her pulse quicken. He took a step closer to her, his presence filling the space between them. Because he said gently, his hand reaching for hers, "I think it's time you saw the woman I see when I look at you. Clara froze, unsure of what he meant. She had seen herself in the mirror 1,000 times, had known who she was in the world of the hotel and the duties she performed. But the way Daniel looked at her, like she was more than just an employee, more than just a face in a sea of guests, was unsettling. It made her question everything she had believed about herself. He led her to the center of the room where a soft light illuminated a large ornate mirror. For a moment, Clara felt a pang of insecurity, but Daniel's hand, warm and steady on her arm, grounded her. "Look at yourself, Clara," he said softly. "Not just the woman who wears the uniform. Look at the woman who's inside." Clara hesitated, but when her eyes met her reflection, she saw something she hadn't expected. The woman in the mirror wasn't just the calm, composed supervisor. She wasn't just the woman who had lived her life behind walls, who had always kept her heart at arm's length. The woman in the mirror was strong, yes, but there was a softness there too, a depth of feeling that Clara had spent years suppressing, hiding from the world and perhaps from herself. The reflection staring back at her was someone who could be vulnerable, someone who could be more than just the sum of her responsibilities. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized what Daniel had meant. This was who he had seen all along. The woman who wasn't afraid to embrace her feelings, who didn't have to hide behind the wall she had built. "It's time," Daniel said, his voice warm but insistent. "It's time for you to step into the world that's waiting for you." Clara turned toward him, her heart racing. His gaze was steady, filled with the kind of quiet encouragement she had never allowed herself to accept. She had always believed that in this world, vulnerability was a weakness, that she had to protect herself at all costs. But now, standing in front of him, she felt something shift. Something inside her was finally willing to let go. "I'm not sure I can do this," she whispered, the uncertainty in her voice betraying the calm exterior she had worked so hard to perfect. Daniel smiled, his eyes soft with understanding. "You already have, Clara. You've been doing it all along. You just needed to see it for yourself." In that moment, Clara realized that the transformation Daniel had spoken of wasn't just about her appearance. It wasn't about the clothes she wore or the role she played at the hotel. It was about the way she saw herself, the way she allowed herself to be seen. She had always defined herself by her duties, by the mask she wore to shield herself from the world. But now, in the quiet of Daniel's gaze, she saw a new possibility. A possibility that embraced not just the strength and composure she had always carried, but the vulnerability she had hidden for so long. And for the first time in her life, Clara felt free. As she stood there in the soft glow of the room, she knew that her transformation had only just begun. But now, for the first time, she was ready to step into the world that was waiting for her. And in doing so, she would no longer be afraid to embrace who she truly was. The night of the gala arrived with an air of anticipation that Clara could feel in her bones. It wasn't just the usual buzz of the hotel, the clinking of glasses, or the polished conversations. No, tonight felt different. Tonight the city seemed to glow just a little brighter, and the stars above shone a little more intensely, as if they knew what was unfolding beneath them. Clara, standing in front of the mirror in her modest apartment, took one last look at herself. She was no longer just the woman who worked behind the desk at the Charlene Tower. She was something else now, something she was still learning to recognize. The dress she wore shimmered like liquid silver, hugging her frame with a quiet elegance that felt almost foreign. The deep neckline framed her collarbones perfectly, the satin fabric catching the light in a way that made her skin glow. Her hair, usually neatly pulled back into a functional bun, now cascaded in waves down her shoulders, soft and untamed. She hadn't thought herself capable of wearing something so refined, but here she was wearing it, owning it, and most importantly, allowing herself to feel worthy of it. Tonight she wasn't just Clara, the hotel supervisor. Tonight she was Clara, the woman who could stand in this world and hold her own. A quiet knock at her door startled her from her thoughts, and before she could respond, the door opened slowly. Daniel stepped into the room, his presence filling the space like a quiet storm. His gaze swept over her, and for a moment the air between them seemed to hum with an intensity that Clara couldn't ignore. He was dressed in a black tuxedo that fit him perfectly, the sharp lines of the suit emphasizing the strength of his frame. His tie, a deep shade of midnight blue, matched the intensity in his eyes. His hair was styled with that same effortless grace, and for a moment Clara found herself breathless. "You look—" He paused, his voice thick with something unspoken. "You look incredible, Clara." The words settled over her like a warm embrace, and she felt her heart flutter in response. There was no artifice in his voice, no hint of condescension or superficial charm. He was speaking the truth, and it was a truth that cut through all the self-doubt Clara had carried with her for so long. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice softer than usual, unsure of how to respond to the flood of emotions that stirred within her. I I never thought I'd be able to wear something like this." Daniel took a slow step forward, his gaze never leaving her face. "You've always been capable of so much more than you realize," he said gently, his tone quiet but filled with meaning. "This is just the beginning." Clara swallowed, her chest tightening. She had always lived in a world of expectations, her own, her family's, the world's. But tonight, in this moment, those expectations felt irrelevant. Daniel was right. She had always been capable of more, but she had never let herself see it until now. He offered her his arm, his expression warm but determined. "Shall we?" he asked, his voice smooth like velvet, as if every word had been carefully chosen. Clara took a breath, feeling the weight of the night ahead. She nodded, slipping her arm through his. "Let's go." The gala was being held at the grand ballroom of the Charlene Tower, an event that had attracted the city's elite, the very people whose worlds Clara had always observed from the outside. The moment she stepped into the ballroom, she was struck by the sheer magnitude of it. The chandeliers above sparkled like a constellation of stars, their light casting delicate shadows across the marble floors. The guests, resplendent in tuxedos and evening gowns, moved gracefully through the space, their laughter and conversation filling the air like music. But as Clara walked further into the room, her pulse quickened, not from fear, but from the realization that this was her world now too. Daniel, standing beside her, made the unfamiliar feel just a little less intimidating. His presence was steady, a silent reassurance that in this world she had a place beside him. They made their way to the center of the ballroom, where a stage had been set up for speeches and performances. As they passed through the crowd, Clara could feel the eyes of the guests on them. Some were curious, others approving, but it was Daniel who commanded attention. The way he moved through the crowd with an effortless confidence was something to behold. And as she stood beside him, Clara realized that she too was no longer just a silent observer. It wasn't long before the event was underway. The music swelled around them, a beautiful symphony of violins and cellos that filled the room with elegance and grace. The guests mingled their conversations, floating on the air like the delicate notes of a melody. Daniel introduced Clara to a few of the city's most influential figures, business moguls, philanthropists, and politicians. Each introduction felt like another layer of her transformation, a step closer to the world she had once only dreamed of inhabiting. But it wasn't the high-profile guests or the grand speeches that held Clara's attention. It was Daniel. As the night wore on, he remained by her side, his gaze never straying far from hers. The way he looked at her, not with the detached interest of a man who had seen it all, but with something deeper, something that felt like recognition, made her heart race. She couldn't help but notice the way he would lean slightly closer whenever she spoke, his hand brushing against hers as if to reassure her. It wasn't just that he cared for her, it was the way he made her feel seen, as though in a room full of people who only saw the surface, he was the one who recognized the truth beneath. She could feel the shift between them, the unspoken understanding that had formed between the two of them, ever since that first night in the hotel lobby. Later in the evening, as the music slowed and the guests began to take to the dance floor, Daniel extended his hand toward her. "May I have this dance?" he asked, his voice low and sincere, a soft smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Clara hesitated, feeling the familiar twinge of uncertainty. She had never danced in a setting like this, never allowed herself to step into the limelight in a way that made her feel exposed. But as she looked into Daniel's eyes, she saw nothing but encouragement. No judgment, no expectations, just the quiet invitation to be part of something more. With a deep breath, Clara placed her hand in his. Yes, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the soft music that filled the room. They moved to the center of the ballroom, and for a moment the world seemed to fall away. The guests, the glittering chandeliers, the grandeur of it all, none of it mattered. In Daniel's arms, Clara felt something she had never felt before, a sense of belonging, a sense of peace. The dance was slow, almost dreamlike, their steps in sync, as though they had been dancing together for years rather than just moments. As they swayed gently to the music, Clara couldn't help but close her eyes, allowing herself to lose herself in the rhythm and the warmth of Daniel's embrace. This was no longer just a dance, it was something more. Something that spoke to the connection between them, something that went beyond the superficial roles they had played in the past. For the first time, Clara allowed herself to believe that she was worthy of this moment, worthy of the world that had always seemed so far out of reach. And as she opened her eyes and met Daniel's gaze, she realized that she wasn't just dancing with him. She was dancing with a future she had once thought impossible, a future that was beginning to feel very much within her grasp. As the music swelled to a gentle crescendo, Daniel's eyes softened, and Clara saw something there she hadn't seen before, love raw and unguarded. It was a look that made her heart skip a beat and her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. But she didn't need to. She understood it in that moment as the music carried them both into a future they would walk together. And for the first time in her life, Clara knew that the world she had always longed to be part of was now hers to embrace. The weeks that followed the gala were a blur of new experiences, new emotions, and a deeper connection with Daniel that both exhilarated and terrified Clara. She had never allowed herself to be this open with someone before, never trusted someone so completely. But with him, everything felt different. The walls she had spent her life building, those impenetrable walls of self-reliance and careful distance, began to crack. Slowly, imperceptibly, Daniel had found a way to slip through the cracks, and Clara, for the first time in her life, let herself fall. They spent their days together in the hotel's grand suites, discussing everything and nothing. Sometimes they ventured out to events, but most often they simply existed in each other's presence, savoring the moments of quiet that Clara had always kept to herself. Daniel would take her to dinner at small hidden spots in the city, away from the constant eyes of the elite. He would drive her through the streets of Chicago, showing her places that weren't part of the glamorous life he had always known, places that reminded Clara of her roots, of the world she had come from. She found herself opening up to him in ways she hadn't thought possible. In the privacy of those moments, the truth of who she was, who she had always been, came spilling out. The fragility she had hidden from the world, the dreams she had shelved away, all of it poured out in quiet conversations as they shared late-night walks along the lakefront or sat in his penthouse watching the city lights twinkle below. But it wasn't all easy. Beneath the surface of their growing connection, there was something else stirring. Something Clara couldn't quite ignore. The tension of two worlds that should never have collided. Daniel with his vast wealth, his connections, his power, and Clara with her humble beginnings, her struggle to prove herself in a world that had always seemed just out of reach. She could feel it growing between them, a subtle shift, an unspoken truth that neither of them dared acknowledge. Daniel had opened up to her in ways she never imagined, but there were parts of him that remained unreachable. Parts of him that belonged to a world Clara could never truly be a part of. It was an uncomfortable truth, one that she had avoided for as long as possible, but now, standing in the glow of his affection, she couldn't avoid it any longer. One evening, after a quiet dinner in one of the hotel's private dining rooms, Clara found herself looking at him differently. They had shared a bottle of wine, their conversation drifting from light-hearted stories to more serious matters. Daniel had been particularly introspective that evening, his gaze distant at times as though he was lost in thought. "Clara," he said, his voice low, his hand resting lightly on hers across the table, "there's something I've been meaning to tell you. Something I should have said a long time ago. Clara's heart skipped a beat. She had heard that tone from him before, the tone that meant he was about to open up in a way that made her feel exposed. It wasn't fear that gripped her, but something else, a nagging sense of uncertainty. She pulled her hand away gently, though her fingers still tingled from the warmth of his touch. "What is it?" she asked, her voice steady, though her stomach churned with a growing apprehension. Daniel looked at her, his gaze intense, as though he was measuring the weight of his words. "I think about you," he said softly, his voice tinged with an emotion that Clara couldn't name. "I think about us, about what we could be. And I want to believe that we can make this work, that we can be something real. But the truth is, Clara," he paused, his brow furrowing as though he were searching for the right words. "The truth is, I don't know how to reconcile who I am with who you are. The life I live, the world I come from, it's not something you can just step into." Clara's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding as his words hit her like a cold rush of wind. She had known deep down that this moment was coming, the moment when the differences between their worlds would become too vast to ignore. And now it was here, hanging in the air between them like a wall neither of them knew how to climb. "Daniel Owam," she began, but he cut her off gently, his eyes soft with regret. "I don't want to hurt you," he said quietly, his voice thick with something that felt almost like apology. "But I need you to understand. I want to be with you, Clara, more than I've ever wanted anything. But I also know that I can't offer you the kind of life you deserve. I can't offer you the kind of love that doesn't come with strings attached. My world is complicated, and I don't want to drag you into it if I'm not sure I can give you what you need." The silence that followed was suffocating. Clara's mind raced, her emotions churning in a storm she couldn't control. This was the moment she had feared, the moment when the truth about their differences became undeniable. The very thing that had drawn her to him, the warmth in his gaze, the tenderness in his touch, now felt like a distant dream. She looked down at her hands, her fingers curling into fists. It wasn't just his world that was complicated, it was hers too. Clara had always known that love was never simple, but she had never imagined it would come wrapped in so many layers of uncertainty. She had always kept herself at arm's length from people like Daniel, people who had everything, who could take what they wanted without ever truly understanding the sacrifices it took to get there. "I don't want you to protect me, Daniel," she said, her voice quiet but firm, though the sting of his words lingered in her chest. "I've never needed protection. I've spent my life fighting for a place in this world. And maybe that's why I don't know how to step into yours." Her words hung in the air between them, the weight of them settling like a thick fog. Clara could feel the tension between them, the push and pull of their desires, their hearts and their worlds. "I'm not asking for a perfect life," she continued, her voice cracking slightly. "I'm asking for something real, something that doesn't have to be perfect, but something that's ours." Daniel's eyes softened, but the pain was still there. He wanted to reach for her, to pull her back into his arms, and promise her that everything would be okay. But there was something in his gaze, a hesitation, that told her he wasn't sure he could promise her anything. "I don't know if I can give you that," he whispered, his voice strained. Clara took a step back, her chest tight with a mixture of frustration and confusion. She had never felt so torn, so uncertain about what she wanted. But in that moment, she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't willing to be a part of a life that wasn't truly hers, no matter how much she cared for Daniel. "I think you already know," she said softly, her voice trembling with the weight of the truth. "We can't pretend that this isn't complicated. We can't pretend that we're not two different people living two different lives." Daniel opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead, he simply nodded, as though he understood what she was saying, as though he too had come to the same painful conclusion. And so for the first time, Clara turned away. She didn't look back, even as she felt his gaze follow her, felt the weight of his longing pulling at her heart. She knew that what they shared was real, more real than anything she had ever known. But some things, no matter how deep the love, couldn't be overcome. She walked away, each step heavier than the last, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of clarity. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was the only road she could take. And as she left the room, she knew that neither of them would ever be the same. The days after their conversation were marked by a strange heaviness, a weight that neither Clara nor Daniel could escape. The shimmering glow of their shared moments, the unspoken connection that had passed between them, now felt distant and fragile, like a dream slipping through the fingers of dawn. Clara had tried to keep herself busy, pouring herself into the duties of her job at the Charlene Tower, distracting herself with the steady rhythm of her work. But every moment when she wasn't surrounded by the buzz of hotel guests or the polished veneer of the luxury that enveloped her, she felt it, the absence of him. Daniel, too, seemed to withdraw, though Clara noticed it was less a retreat and more a careful distance, as though he were weighing his every move, choosing his words with a deliberation that had never been there before. He was trying, Clara realized, trying to understand what they had between them, trying to piece together a way to make it work. But the effort felt increasingly like a struggle against something neither of them could control. And then came the call, the one she had been expecting, yet somehow dreading. It was late one evening when her phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with a message from Daniel. Her heart skipped, a strange mix of hope and apprehension stirring in her chest. She had spent the past few days thinking about him constantly, and yet she had avoided reaching out herself. What was there to say? They were caught in this unspoken limbo, both wanting something that was impossible to define and both too afraid to truly face it. The text was simple: "Can we talk?" She didn't hesitate. The words were like a summons, drawing her in with an urgency that had nothing to do with the words themselves and everything to do with the emotion behind them. She responded almost immediately, "Of course." Within minutes, she was in her car driving through the streets of Chicago, the weight of the night settling in the pit of her stomach. The cool night air pressed against her skin as she drove, and despite the clarity she had gained over the past few days, she still felt the uncertainty tugging at her. What would this conversation be? What was left to say? The thought of walking away from Daniel, of walking away from whatever fragile thread of connection still lingered between them, felt like a betrayal. And yet the question had always been the same. Could they ever truly reconcile their worlds? The Charlene Tower loomed in the distance as she approached, its towering silhouette cutting through the inky sky. She parked in the familiar underground lot, her hands gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly, her breath shallow and quick. When she stepped out of the car, she could already feel the pull of the penthouse floor where Daniel awaited her, like the calm before a storm. As she stepped into the elevator, Clara found herself staring at the rising numbers, her reflection staring back at her with an almost hollow expression. She had always been strong, had always kept her heart guarded, wrapped in layers of practicality and self-preservation. But with Daniel, the walls had started to fall, and now she wasn't sure where she stood. The world he inhabited, the life he had built, felt so far removed from everything she knew. When the elevator doors opened, Clara walked into the penthouse, and the first thing she noticed was the quiet. The usual bustle, the energy that usually filled the space was gone. The living room was dimly lit, casting shadows that stretched across the floors, and Daniel was standing by the window, his back to her. For a moment, Clara simply watched him, the man who had caused so many of her quiet thoughts, the man who had made her question everything she thought she knew about herself. He turned slowly, as if he had known she was there all along. "Clara," he said softly, his voice tinged with something uncertain, something raw. "I'm glad you came." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. There was a tightness in her chest, a lump in her throat as she walked toward him. She could feel the weight of the conversation that awaited them, and the anticipation of what was to come made her pulse quicken. "I've been thinking about what you said." Daniel continued, his gaze never leaving hers. "About the difference in our worlds, about how I've always lived in a bubble, a world where things are so simple because I can make them simple. But when it comes to you, I can't make this simple. I can't protect you from this." Clara's heart clenched. She hadn't expected him to be so open, so vulnerable. She had known Daniel as a man of strength, of control, but in that moment she saw something else. The uncertainty in his eyes, the confusion in his posture. He was just as lost as she was, just as unsure of what to do with the feelings that had grown between them. "You don't need to protect me," she said quietly, stepping closer. "I've never needed that. What I need is for you to be honest with me, to tell me what's really going on in your heart. I don't want to live in the shadows of your world, Daniel. I need to know if there's a place for me in it, in your life." His eyes softened and he stepped closer, his gaze searching hers as though trying to read the truth in her eyes. "I want you in my life, Clara. I want you more than I've ever wanted anything. But I don't know if I can give you what you need. I don't know if I can be the man you want me to be." Clara felt her breath catch, the words hitting her like a punch to the gut. She had known deep down that this moment was coming, that they would eventually have to face the reality of who they were and what they had. But hearing it from him, seeing the struggle in his eyes, made the truth so much harder to accept. "What do you want from me, Daniel?" Clara asked, her voice trembling, now the dam she had built around her emotions finally beginning to crack. "Tell me what you want, and I'll tell you if I can give it to you." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "I don't know. I don't know what I want. I want you, Clara, but I also know that I can't ask you to live in a world that doesn't understand you. My world, my family, the expectations they have for me, it's all too much. It's too much for anyone, let alone someone as..." Someone as what Clara cut in, her voice rising now, the frustration and hurt slipping through the cracks of her calm demeanor. "Someone as ordinary as me. Someone who wasn't born into a life of privilege, who didn't have everything handed to them on a silver platter." Daniel's eyes widened, his face softening with regret. "No, Clara, that's not what I meant. You're not ordinary. You're extraordinary. That's what I've been trying to tell you, but I can't give you the life I've built. It's not fair to you." Clara took a step back, her chest tight with the weight of his words. It wasn't just the difference in their worlds that stung. It was the realization that Daniel was holding something back, something he wasn't telling her. And she could feel it, the walls he had built, the hesitations that had crept between them. "You're right," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "Maybe we are too different. Maybe we can't make this work. But I don't want to live in a world where we keep pretending that we can. Not anymore." There was a long silence between them, both of them standing on the precipice of something they couldn't fully understand. The tension in the room thickened, and for a moment neither of them knew how to bridge the distance between them. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice raw, his gaze never leaving hers. "Clara, I don't know what comes next, but I do know that I'm not ready to let you go." Clara swallowed the lump in her throat, her heart heavy with uncertainty. "Then show me, Daniel. Show me that you're willing to fight for us no matter how impossible it seems." The words hung in the air, an open invitation, but Clara wasn't sure if he could accept them or if in the end they would even be enough. The days that followed the tension-filled conversation between Clara and Daniel seemed to stretch endlessly. Each moment was fraught with uncertainty, the silence between them loud enough to fill the vast spaces of the Charlene Tower. Daniel had promised he wasn't ready to let her go, but his actions told a different story. He had become more distant, his professional duties taking precedence over everything else. It was clear that he was torn, caught between his feelings for her and the overwhelming pressure of the life he had built, the life that now seemed impossible to offer her without reservations. Clara, too, found herself torn. She wanted so desperately to believe in the connection they shared, to believe that love could be enough to bridge the gap between their worlds. But with each passing day, she felt the weight of reality pressing down on her. Their lives, their worlds were too different. No matter how hard they tried to fit into each other's spaces, something always pulled them apart. The more Clara saw the distance growing between them, the more she realized that the future she had once imagined with him might never come to fruition. It was late one evening when the phone rang, its sharp tone cutting through the quiet of her apartment. Clara's heart skipped a beat when she saw Daniel's name flash across the screen. For a moment she hesitated. She had spent the past few days avoiding him, trying to make sense of her feelings, but the pull to speak to him was undeniable. She answered with a breathless, "Hello." Clara Daniels' voice came through deep and measured, though there was a slight edge to it. I need to see you. The urgency in his voice sent a ripple of anxiety through her chest. She could hear the faint sounds of the city in the background, a hum of life that seemed distant and foreign compared to the quiet that had settled around her. Where are you? She asked, her voice calm, but betraying the unease she felt. She knew the conversation was coming, knew that they couldn't avoid it any longer. The penthouse, he replied, the single word heavy was something she couldn't quite name. Please, Clara, I need to explain. I need you to hear me out. Clara felt the knot in her stomach tighten, but she didn't hesitate. I'll be there. When she arrived at the penthouse, the door opened before she could even knock. Daniel stood there looking as impeccable as always, his suit tailored to perfection. But the look in his eyes was different tonight. There was something in his gaze, a quiet intensity, that made her pulse quicken. He stepped aside, allowing her into the room. The familiar grandeur of the penthouse, with its sweeping views of the city below, felt cold, now sterile. It was as if the space had become a cage, one that both of them were trapped in, unable to escape the expectations that had built up between them. Clara Daniels said, his voice low, but there was a note of finality in it that made her freeze. He walked toward the center of the room, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture tense. I've spent the past few days thinking about what you said, about us, about what I can offer you. Clara swallowed a mix of dread and anticipation swirling inside her. She could feel the heaviness of the moment pressing down on her. She had always known that they would reach this point, the moment when the reality of their differences would be laid bare, the moment when they would have to face what came next. Daniel, I don't want you to, Clara began, but he raised his hand, cutting her off. No, he said firmly, his gaze fixed on hers. I'm the one who needs to say this. I owe you the truth. The air between them felt thick, the weight of his words pressing down on her chest. She braced herself, unsure of what was coming, but knowing that whatever it was, it would change everything. I've been thinking, Daniel continued, his voice more measured now, as though he were choosing his words carefully, about what I can offer you. What I can give you that would make this thing between us work. Clara's heart raced, but she kept her expression neutral, waiting for him to continue. She had always believed that their connection was the most important thing, that love, however imperfect, was enough. But now in this moment, she wondered if love alone would ever be enough. You're right, he said, his voice tinged with a mixture of regret and something else, something like determination. I can't offer you a life without strings attached. My world doesn't work that way. The responsibilities, the expectations, I can't shield you from all of it. It's too much, Clara. It's too complicated. Clara's heart sank, the words striking her like a blow. She had always known deep down that the life Daniel lived would come with its challenges, but hearing him say it so plainly felt like a gut punch. She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that they could make it work, that love was enough to overcome the obstacles. But as she looked at him, saw the frustration in his eyes, she knew that he had already made up his mind. So what are you saying, Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. That this isn't going to work, that we can't have something real? Daniel's expression softened, and for the first time Clara saw the vulnerability in his eyes, the vulnerability he had kept hidden behind the mask of power and control. I'm not saying that, he replied quietly, stepping closer to her. What I'm saying is that I can offer you something. Something you've never had before, a life of luxury, of security. I can give you everything, anything you want, but you have to understand that it comes with conditions. Clara took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. Conditions, she repeated, her voice tinged with disbelief. Daniel nodded slowly. Yes, I want you to be with me, Clara, but I can't offer you a life that's free of the world I live in. If you're going to be a part of this my world, then you have to accept it. You have to accept the expectations, the scrutiny, the demands. You'll have everything, money, status, security, but you won't be free. Not completely. Clara stood there, her mind racing as she processed his words. The offer was so tempting, so intoxicating. A life free from worry, free from struggle, where everything she had ever dreamed of was within her reach. And yet in that same moment, something deep inside her recoiled. She wasn't just some prize to be won. She wasn't willing to trade her independence, her sense of self, for a gilded cage. "I can't do that, Daniel," she said softly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "I can't live in a world where I'm constantly being controlled, where I'm expected to play a part in your life, but never truly be a part of it. I can't be your accessory, your arm candy, no matter how beautiful the life you offer is." Daniel's face faltered, his eyes darkening with frustration. "I'm not asking you to be an accessory," he said, his voice tight. "I'm offering you everything I can give you, Clara. You don't have to fight for anything anymore. I can take care of you. You'd never have to struggle again." Clara shook her head, the sting of his words cutting through her like shards of glass. "That's not enough," she said quietly. "It's not just about what you can give me, Daniel. It's about who I am in this world, about whether I can be with someone who truly sees me, who truly accepts me for who I am, not just for what I can bring to your life." There was a long silence, the tension between them thick and heavy. Daniel didn't move, his gaze locked on hers as though searching for something he couldn't find. Finally, he spoke, his voice hoarse. "I don't know how to do this, Clara. I don't know how to give you the life you want without giving up everything I've worked for." Clara's heart ached at the sincerity in his voice. She didn't want to hurt him, didn't want to walk away from the man she had come to care for so deeply. But in that moment, she realized that she couldn't accept an offer that came with strings attached, no matter how much she wanted to believe that they could make it work. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her voice breaking. "I can't be part of a life that doesn't leave me free to be myself. I'm sorry." And with that, the space between them became impossibly vast. The offer, the proposal with its strings attached, lay between them like a chasm that neither of them could cross. The love they shared was real, but sometimes love wasn't enough to overcome the things that divided them. The days after Clara's decision passed in a haze of numbness, each one slipping into the next like a forgotten dream. The Charlene Tower, once the place of quiet joy and connection between her and Daniel, now seemed like a foreign landscape, vast, cold, and impersonal. Her steps through the polished marble floors felt heavier, and the familiar hum of hotel life, once a comforting background, now seemed oppressive, a constant reminder of the choice she had made. She had walked away, and in doing so had torn a piece of her heart out, leaving an ache that reverberated through every moment. It wasn't just the loss of Daniel that weighed on her. It was the loss of something else, something deeper. The realization that she had let herself hope for something more than she could ever have. The love they shared, so real and intense, had come with a price she was unwilling to pay. The walls she had spent so long building, the barriers that had kept her safe from the world, had begun to crack, and in those cracks the truth had slipped through. She wasn't meant to belong in his world, not fully, not in the way that would make her feel whole. Clara's routine became her refuge. Work was the only place where she could bury the fragments of herself that still longed for Daniel's touch. His smile, the quiet way he had looked at her, as though she were the only person in the world who mattered. But in the silence of the hotel's late hours, when the guests had retired to their rooms, and the once vibrant ballroom now stood empty, those memories would return sharp, painful, and insistent. She found herself pacing the halls more often than usual, her mind adrift in a sea of questions that had no answers. Why had she let herself get so close to him? Why had she believed that she could overcome the differences between their worlds? The questions felt like a weight around her chest, one that grew heavier with each passing hour. And then one evening, just as Clara was finishing her shift, she received a message that stopped her in her tracks. The words on the screen were simple, but they cut through her like a blade. "Can we talk?" It was from Daniel. Her breath caught in her throat. She had avoided him for days, had convinced herself that the space between them was necessary, that the decision she had made was the right one. But now, standing alone in the empty lobby, she felt the pull of him, the magnetic force that had drawn them together from the very beginning. She knew she couldn't avoid him forever. They couldn't remain in this suspended state of hurt and silence. Taking a steadying breath, Clara replied, "Yes." "Where?" My place, I need you to come. The message was terse, but there was something in it, a desperation she hadn't expected. She couldn't explain it, but she knew this would be the conversation that decided everything. It would be the reckoning, the moment when the truth of their separation would finally be revealed. As she drove to his penthouse, the night around her seemed to blur, the city lights streaking past in a haze of motion. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, the familiar path to the penthouse now filled with a weight she hadn't anticipated. She wasn't sure what to expect from Daniel. The last time they had spoken, he had offered her a life she couldn't accept, had promised everything, but left the price of his love unspoken. When the elevator doors opened, Clara stepped out into the penthouse, and it was as if nothing had changed and everything had changed. The familiar scent of his cologne, the soft hum of the city outside the windows, it all felt the same. But the space between them, the tension in the air was palpable. Daniel was waiting for her by the window, his back to her, his broad shoulders tense with uncertainty. His usual composure was gone, replaced by a raw vulnerability that made Clara's heart ache. He turned slowly as she entered his eyes, locking with hers, filled with a storm of emotions she couldn't quite name. Clara, he said, his voice tight, with something that felt like frustration, but also something else, something softer. I didn't know how to do this. I didn't know how to say it. Clara took a deep breath, her heart racing. She had thought about this moment 1,000 times, had imagined every possible outcome, but now that it was here, she felt a sense of helplessness she hadn't expected. She had tried to distance herself from him, to move on, but the truth was that Daniel had gotten under her skin in a way no one ever had before. I don't know what you want from me, Daniel, Clara said, her voice trembling slightly. You've already told me everything, told me that we can't be together the way I want. You said you couldn't give me what I need. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, his face tightening with frustration. That's not what I meant, he said, his voice low and raw. Clara, you've misunderstood. I've been trying to protect you from the mess of my life, from the complexities of what it means to be with me. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I was wrong. I was wrong to think that I could keep you away from this, that I could let you go. Clara blinked, surprised by the emotion in his voice. What are you saying? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm saying that I can't live without you, Daniel replied, stepping closer, his eyes searching hers as though he was trying to communicate something deeper, something he hadn't yet said. I thought I could, but I can't. I need you, Clara. I need you more than I ever thought possible. Her breath caught in her throat. She had been bracing for another lecture, for more excuses about why their worlds couldn't align, about why they were always going to be too different. But this wasn't what she expected. I've been offering you everything but the one thing you truly want, he continued, his voice low and filled with regret. I've been offering you a life of luxury, of safety, but I never gave you the one thing that truly matters, my heart. Clara's mind raced, her emotions colliding in a whirlwind of confusion. This was the moment when everything would come to a head. She had hoped for this, had wanted him to see the truth, but now that it was here, she didn't know if she could accept it. Daniel, she began, her voice soft, trembling with the weight of the decision she was about to make. I can't live in a world that's built on conditions. I can't live in a world where I'm constantly fighting to fit in, to prove my worth. I don't want a life that's easy. I just want one that's real. Daniel stepped closer, his hand reaching for hers. Then let me make it real, Clara. Let me show you that I can be the man you need. Let me prove to you that I can be more than just the man you think I am. Her heart ached with the intensity of his words, the rawness of his plea. But deep down, Clara knew that nothing would ever truly change. Their worlds were too far apart, their lives too entangled in the expectations that they couldn't escape. I love you, Daniel, she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. But love isn't enough if we're not being honest with each other. And I don't know if I can trust that you'll ever give me the truth, the real truth. He looked at her, the depth of his feelings reflected in his eyes. Clara, I swear to you, I'll give you everything I have, everything I can. But I need you to believe me. Clara closed her eyes, the weight of his words settling in her chest like a stone. She loved him. She always would. But love, she knew, wasn't enough to overcome the distance between their worlds. And so with a final look, with a heart heavy with loss and a mind made up, she turned away. She walked out of the penthouse, the door closing softly behind her, leaving behind the man she loved and the life she could never have. The reckoning was over, and in its wake only silence remained. The days after she left Daniel were the hardest Clara had ever known. It was a strange kind of grief, one that didn't quite have a shape or form, just an empty space, hollow and aching, that seemed to stretch through every part of her life. It was as if she had given away a piece of herself, one she didn't even know she had until it was gone. And the worst part was the quiet. The silence that followed her decision was not comforting. It was suffocating. She had thought walking away would be easier. She had told herself that she was making the right choice, that she was protecting herself from a future that could never be hers. But now, standing in the quiet of her apartment, she felt nothing but the weight of that loss. It was late one evening when the phone rang, breaking the stillness. Clara hesitated, staring at the screen. Daniel's name flashed across it, and for a moment she couldn't move. Every cell in her body seemed to freeze as she fought the impulse to answer. She had told herself she would leave him behind, but hearing his name, knowing that he was on the other end of that line, made her ache with longing. With a shaky breath she pressed, "Accept," and the familiar sound of his voice filled her ear. "Clara," Daniel's voice was strained thick with emotion. "I need you to listen to me." Her chest tightened and she could barely form words. She had known this call would come. He couldn't just let her walk away. But the truth was, she didn't know what to say to him anymore. She had already said everything she needed to say, hadn't she? "I can't do this, Daniel," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't keep living in this limbo, loving you, and knowing that we can never truly be together." "I know," Daniel said quietly. "I know you're hurting. I'm hurting too. But I can't accept that this is the end of us. I can't let you go." His words stung like salt on an open wound. How could he still want her after everything they had gone through? How could he still think that love alone could fix the irreparable distance between their worlds? "I never asked you to let me go," Clara replied, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I asked you to let me in. But you couldn't, Daniel. You couldn't let go of your world long enough to see me. And that's why I had to leave." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Clara could hear him breathing, as if trying to find the right words, the right thing to say, to make everything better. But nothing could make it better. Nothing could erase the weight of their differences, the unspeakable chasm that had grown between them. "Clara," he said finally, his voice softer, now quieter. "I don't want to live in a world where you're not in it. I thought I could keep my distance, keep my control, but I can't. I can't be without you." The admission hit her like a punch to the gut. He loved her, there was no doubt in his words. But love alone wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. She had tried so hard to make sense of the chaos of her feelings, to fit herself into the life he offered her. But in the end, it wasn't enough. He wasn't enough, not in the way that she needed him to be. "Daniel, you've always had everything," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. "And I've always had nothing. You gave me everything you thought I wanted, but in the end, you couldn't give me the one thing I needed: a place in your world. Not just beside you, but with you. I wanted to give you that," he said, his voice raw, filled with emotion. "I wanted to, but I didn't know how. I didn't know how to bridge the gap between us, how to make it work without losing everything else." Clara closed her eyes, allowing the tears she had been holding back to fall freely now. She had never expected this, never expected him to be so open, so vulnerable. But it didn't change the truth of their situation. She wasn't willing to be a part of a world that only half accepted her. She had always believed in the possibility of love, in the idea that it could overcome anything. But Daniel had shown her with every gesture, every moment, that love was not enough to change the foundations of their lives. "I loved you, Daniel," she said, her voice breaking on the last word. "I still do. But loving you isn't enough when it means losing myself. I don't belong in your world, and I can't keep trying to force myself to fit in it." She didn't wait for him to respond. The truth hung in the air between them like an impenetrable wall. She had made her decision. She had walked away for herself, and now she needed to honor that decision. The line went silent for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. I understand, Clara. I wish I could have been enough. But I can't make you stay. I know that now. I'm sorry, she whispered, her heart shattering with the weight of the words she had to say. I'm so sorry. The words felt hollow in her mouth, but there was nothing else left to say. She had tried. They had tried. But sometimes, no matter how much love you had for someone, no matter how deeply you wanted to make it work, the differences were too great, the forces pulling you apart too strong. Clara ended the call, her hands trembling as she set the phone down. She sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the cold screen in front of her, the silence now pressing in on her from every side. She had made the right decision, she knew that, but it didn't make the emptiness any easier to bear. She had lost the man she loved, and yet in the quiet of her apartment, she felt an even greater loss, the loss of herself. The woman who had believed in the possibility of love, the woman who had fought so hard to prove she could fit into a world that wasn't hers, now stood alone, her heart cracked and bruised. The ache of heartbreak settled over her like a heavy blanket, and for the first time in her life, Clara allowed herself to grieve not just for the love she had lost, but for the woman she had become in the process. The woman who had given so much of herself only to be left standing in the ruins of what might have been. As the night stretched on, Clara realized that heartbreak was a form of rebirth. And though it hurt more than anything she had ever known, she also knew that in time she would find a way to heal. It would take time. It would take patience. But she would find herself again. And in that, she would learn to love herself not as a reflection of someone else's world, but as the woman she was meant to be. And perhaps someday she would find a love that didn't demand sacrifice, a love that allowed her to be whole, but for now she was enough, and that at least was a start. The weeks that followed Clara's decision to walk away from Daniel were long and quiet each day, a slow unraveling of the life she had once imagined with him. The space she had left between them, the distance of time and distance itself, became a refuge and a cage. She threw herself into her work at the Charlene Tower, finding comfort in the routine, the structure of it all, but beneath the surface there was still a hollow ache, one that didn't fade with the passing days. She had told herself it was for the best, that she couldn't keep giving parts of herself away, only to find that the world she had entered with Daniel was one that could never fully accept her. Yet the emptiness, the quiet ache of loss, made her question everything she had believed. Could she truly move on? Was she stronger for leaving him? Or was she just running from the vulnerability that had come with loving someone so deeply? But in the midst of the silence, something had begun to shift within her. Clara had always been defined by her determination, her drive to succeed despite the odds. But now she was learning something new. She was learning how to breathe again, how to find peace in her own presence. She had always been so focused on the world around her, on proving her worth, that she had forgotten how to simply be. One late afternoon, as the golden light of dusk filtered through the hotel's tall windows, Clara found herself standing in the lobby, staring out at the busy streets of Chicago. It had been weeks since she had heard from Daniel, and she had told herself she was ready to move on. She had told herself that she had made the right decision, that walking away was the only way to preserve herself. And yet the truth remained, she hadn't fully let go. The memories, the laughter, the quiet moments shared between them, all of it still lingered in the corners of her mind. She hadn't just lost him. She had lost the part of herself that had come alive in his presence. That woman, the one who had believed in the possibility of love and the power of connection, was still somewhere inside her, waiting to be seen again. Clara closed her eyes, leaning against the cool marble of the front desk. She had tried to forget, to bury those feelings deep down where they wouldn't hurt so much. But the truth was, she hadn't been able to. She wasn't sure if she ever would. That's when it happened. The sound of footsteps approached slow and measured the familiar rhythm of a man's stride that she had come to recognize even in the chaos of the hotel's busiest moments. Clara's heart stopped, a sudden sharp pain racing through her chest. She didn't have to turn around to know who it was. She had always known, hadn't she? The moment Daniel entered her life, it was as though her heart had known him long before her mind had. Clara Daniel's voice came softly, a tentative note in his words, as though he were unsure of how to approach her, unsure of how to bridge the gap that had grown between them. "Can we talk?" She didn't turn to face him immediately. She couldn't. The vulnerability that flooded her at the sound of his voice, the memories of everything they had shared, made her feel exposed raw. Her hands clenched against the desk, her breath shallow as she tried to steady herself. "Daniel," she finally said, her voice soft yet firm with the weight of everything she had been through. "You know we can't keep doing this." "I know," he replied quietly, taking a step closer. "But I'm not here to ask you to take me back, Clara. I'm not here to ask for anything other than a chance to explain." Clara finally turned her gaze, meeting his. His eyes, filled with an intensity she had always recognized but never fully understood, locked onto hers. The months of silence, the distance between them, had carved lines into his face, but his gaze was the same, steady, searching, and painfully honest. "I've spent weeks thinking about what you said," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "About the way I pushed you away, about how I never truly saw you for who you were. I saw you as someone I wanted to fix, someone I could keep in my world. But I never stopped to see you as someone who could stand beside me, someone who didn't need fixing. I was so focused on what I could offer you, I never realized that I had to offer you me, the real me. Not the version of me that I thought you needed, but the version of me that you deserved." Clara's breath caught in her throat as his words washed over her. She had always known Daniel to be a man of strength, of control, but now standing before her, he was something else, something she hadn't allowed herself to see. He was vulnerable, and for the first time, Clara felt a flicker of something familiar in her chest. Hope. "Daniel, what?" Clara's voice faltered as emotions she had kept buried for so long surged to the surface. She wanted to speak, wanted to tell him that she had moved on, that she had healed. But the truth was, she hadn't healed. Not fully, not without him. "I'm not asking you to give up everything you've worked for," Daniel continued, stepping closer, his hand reaching out as though to touch her, but stopping just short. "I'm asking you to give me a chance to be the man you need. Not the man I thought you needed, but the man I know I can be for you." Clara's eyes softened as she searched his face, seeing the sincerity there, the openness. She had spent so much time protecting herself, convincing herself that love wasn't enough, that she didn't need someone like him to complete her. But standing here in this moment, she realized something. "Daniel," she whispered, the words trembling on her lips. "You were enough. You always have been. But I needed you to be more than just the man you thought you were. I needed you to see me, see who I am, without trying to change me." There was a long pause, the space between them filled with everything they had yet to say. And then, with a quiet determination, Daniel stepped forward and gently took her hand in his. "I see you, Clara," he said, his voice unwavering. "I see the woman you've always been, the woman I've always known I needed." For a moment, Clara allowed herself to believe that they could be more than just two people trying to fit into a world that didn't understand them. She had fought so long to protect her heart, to keep herself safe from the risk of loving someone who couldn't give her everything. But now in this moment, she realized that love didn't have to come with conditions. It didn't have to be perfect. It just had to be real. "I'm sorry," Daniel whispered, his thumb brushing over the back of her hand. "I should have done this sooner. I should have fought for you." Clara's heart swelled with emotion as she looked into his eyes, the past weeks of heartache and loss slowly fading into the background. She had let him go, once convinced that she was strong enough to stand alone. But now, with him standing in front of her, offering her the chance to build something new, something real, she realized that maybe they could make this work. "Maybe we don't need to fix everything," Clara said softly, her voice full of quiet certainty. "Maybe we just need to start again, together." Daniel smiled, a soft, relieved smile that reached his eyes. "Together," he repeated, as if the word itself held the promise of everything they could be. And in that moment, standing together in the soft light of the penthouse, Clara knew that the journey ahead would still be uncertain, still filled with challenges, but it would no longer be a journey she had to face alone. For the first time in a long time, Clara felt the weight in her chest begin to lift, replaced by the quiet certainty that love in all its messy, imperfect glory was worth the risk. And in that certainty, Clara found her redemption. The weeks that followed were a quiet unfolding, a slow transformation as Clara and Daniel rebuilt their lives together, piece by delicate piece. The journey hadn't been easy, and it never promised to be, but they both had learned something invaluable along the way. Love was not about perfection, but about understanding, about seeing each other for who they truly were, and accepting its flaws and all. Clara had allowed herself to hope again. She had finally opened her heart to the possibility that she could have a life filled with love, not just the love she had always dreamed of, but a real tangible love that was messy and imperfect and full of moments of growth. She had learned to let go of the idea that she needed to fit into someone else's world. Instead, she had come to realize that their world, her and Daniel's, was something they would build together, something that was uniquely theirs. The turning point had come one bright Saturday afternoon when Daniel had suggested they take a weekend trip to the countryside. A small, quiet retreat away from the noise of their busy lives, a chance to reconnect without the pressures of the city or the expectations of their respective worlds. The drive out to the countryside was long and winding, the landscape changing from the urban chaos of Chicago to the open expanses of green fields and golden sun. They arrived at a small cottage nestled in the hills, a place that felt more like a dream than a reality. The walls were made of stone, and the scent of pine and earth filled the air. It was a place where time seemed to slow down, where the hustle and bustle of the world outside seemed a lifetime away. And as Clara stood on the small porch of the cottage, looking out over the hills, she realized something profound. This was the life she wanted, not the life she had imagined for herself all those years ago, a life dictated by rules and expectations, but a life filled with simple moments like this, quiet, unassuming, and full of love. Daniel stood beside her, his hand resting gently on her back, and she turned to look at him. There was something different in his eyes now, something deeper. The guard he had always worn so carefully was gone, replaced by a man who was open, vulnerable, and willing to embrace the future, no matter how uncertain it might be. "I've been thinking," Daniel began, his voice soft, his gaze never leaving hers, "about how far we've come, about how much I've learned from you, from us." Clara smiled, her heart swelling with affection for him. "I've been thinking the same thing. I never imagined that love would feel this way, like coming home even when everything around you is still changing." Daniel chuckled softly, his hand brushing against her hair, the touch gentle and affectionate. "I never thought I'd be capable of something like this, but you've taught me that it's not about having everything figured out. It's about being willing to grow together." She nodded, the warmth of his words wrapping around her like a blanket. "I've learned that too. I've learned that love isn't just a feeling, it's a choice we make every day." For a moment they stood there in comfortable silence, watching the world go by. The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden light across the fields. It was a moment of stillness, of peace, and it was theirs to share. Later that evening, as the stars began to twinkle above them, Daniel led Clara to a small table set up under the wide-open sky. Soft candlelight flickered against the backdrop of the darkening night, casting a warm glow over the simple but intimate setting. The world felt suspended in time, as if everything was waiting for the moment that was about to unfold. Clara sat down, her eyes wide, as she took in the scene before her. She had never imagined something so perfect, so utterly romantic, and yet here it was unfolding before her. Daniel knelt beside her, his hand reaching for hers. His face was serious now, his eyes filled with an intensity that made Clara's heart race. The air between them seemed charged with anticipation. "Clara," Daniel said softly, his voice trembling slightly, "from the moment I met you, I knew there was something about you that I couldn't walk away from. I've learned more from you than I ever thought possible. You've made me a better man, a man who's not afraid to love with everything he has, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you." Clara's breath caught in her throat as her eyes welled with tears. She hadn't expected this moment, hadn't prepared herself for the whirlwind of emotions that swept through her. But here he was, the man she loved, asking her to be a part of his life, in a way that felt so right, so true. Daniel pulled a small velvet box from his pocket and opened it to reveal a simple but exquisite ring, a diamond surrounded by a circle of smaller stones set in a band of gold that shimmered in the candlelight. Clara gasped softly, her heart racing, as the magnitude of the moment hit her. "Clara," Daniel said, his voice barely a whisper, "now will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Clara's cheeks and she could hardly speak. The words caught in her throat, and for a moment all she could do was nod, a smile breaking across her face. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I'll marry you." The weight of the moment settled around them like a cocoon, and in that instant, everything they had been through, the distance, the heartbreak, the uncertainty, seemed to fade away. This was their moment, the beginning of their forever. Daniel stood pulling her into his arms, holding her tightly, as if he was afraid to ever let go. Clara wrapped her arms around him, letting herself fall into the warmth of his embrace, knowing that this was the beginning of something beautiful, something real. As they stood there under the blanket of stars, Clara knew that the road ahead would still be filled with challenges. There would be days of doubt, moments of fear, and the inevitable tests that came with love. But she also knew that they had something worth fighting for, a love that had endured, had been tested, and had come out stronger on the other side. And in Daniel's arms, with the world spread out before them, Clara felt like the luckiest woman alive. She wasn't just standing beside him anymore. She was standing with him, building a future together, one step at a time. For the first time in her life, Clara believed in fairy tales, not because they were perfect, but because they were real. And this, their story, was a fairy tale that had only just begun. The seasons shifted in Chicago, as they always did, but Clara felt as though her life had settled into a rhythm that was entirely her own, a new beginning she had never thought possible. The cold winter gave way to the soft blush of spring, the trees lining the streets of the city starting to bud with the promise of something fresh and new. And as the world outside seemed to come alive once again, so did her heart. She had given herself over to the love that Daniel had offered her, and with that love came a life more beautiful than she had ever dared to imagine. The engagement had been a whirlwind, a moment in time that had stretched and deepened, like a dream woven into reality. Daniel, standing beside her, had turned into the man she had always needed, not the idealized figure she once thought him to be. No, Daniel was now fully human, vulnerable, honest, and utterly devoted to her, and that was more than enough. They had spent months planning their future together, slowly weaving their lives into one shared tapestry, patching over the gaps and imperfections with trust, understanding, and a love that had grown into something that was no longer fragile, but fierce, unbreakable. But it wasn't just the grand moments of their engagement or their quiet days together in the cottage that Clara cherished. It was the smaller moments, the ones that at first seemed insignificant, but were the true foundation of everything they had built. The way Daniel made her coffee in the morning, always with a splash of cream, just the way she liked it. The way he would hold her hand in the quiet of the evening, their fingers intertwining like the threads of their hearts, perfectly matched. How he would laugh at her silly jokes, never once treating her like she was less than his equal, always seeing her for the woman she had become. And Clara, she had given herself over to him in ways she hadn't thought she could. She had stopped running from vulnerability, stopped protecting herself from the kind of love that could leave her exposed. Instead, she had embraced it with an open heart, allowing herself to love Daniel not because of who he was or what he could offer her, but because of who he was with her. He was the one who had seen her at her lowest and accepted her without question. He was the one who had stayed when she had doubted herself, when she had questioned if love could be real or if she was even worthy of it. He was the one who made her believe that she was. The day of their wedding arrived like a dream. Clara had always envisioned the day she would marry, but no day had ever felt quite so real, so alive with the love that had led her here. She stood in front of the full-length mirror in the bridal suite, dressed in an ivory gown that shimmered softly like the reflection of her heart. The dress was simple but elegant, a perfect balance of grace and strength. Her hair fell softly around her face in waves, and as she adjusted her veil, her reflection made her pause for a moment. She looked at herself, at the woman she had become, and saw not just the surface but the depth. She saw the woman who had fought so hard for her independence, who had struggled to find a place in a world that always seemed to ask too much. But now standing here, she saw a woman who had found that place not in the world around her, but within herself. And she saw that her heart, once broken and guarded, was now whole. Whole because Daniel had come into her life and loved her for all of it, the good, the messy, the broken, and the beautiful. And when she turned to face him standing at the altar in the grand ballroom of the Charlene Tower, Daniel looked at her with a mixture of awe and disbelief. The room filled with family friends and the elite of the city seemed to fade away. It was as if the world had been created for this moment, the two of them coming together, no longer bound by their pasts, but by a future they would build together. As Clara took his hand, their fingers locking in a familiar, comforting way, she felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just a promise to love him, to stand by his side. It was a promise to live the life they had created for each other, to face the challenges ahead with the same love and strength they had shown each other in their quiet moments. Daniel's voice, low and sincere, echoed in the room as he began the vows that would bind them together. "Clara," he said, his eyes never leaving hers from the moment we met, "I knew there was something in you that changed me. You taught me to see love not as a gift to be earned, but as something that grows, something that builds between two people who are willing to put everything on the line. I promise to be with you in every way for all of our days. I will hold you when you are weak, and I will stand beside you when you are strong. I will love you not as the woman I thought you should be, but as the woman you are, for all your beauty, for all your strength, for all your vulnerability." Clara's heart swelled with emotion as she gazed at him, her love for him deeper than she had ever imagined it could be. She reached for his hand, her fingers trembling slightly, and she spoke her vows to him, her voice steady, but filled with all the emotion she had carried for so long. "Daniel, I promise to love you with everything I have. I promise to always see you, not as the man who has everything, but as the man who has shown me what love can truly be. I promise to be with you not just in the easy moments, but in the hard ones too. I promise to grow with you, to laugh with you, to cry with you, and to build a life with you. I will never stop choosing you, Daniel, because you are my home." As she spoke those words, Clara knew that love wasn't something to be earned or fought for. It was something that was built day by day, choice by choice, even in the midst of uncertainty. And in that moment, standing before Daniel, she knew that this was her forever. The love they had created together was the kind of love she had once dreamed about in her quietest moments, the kind of love that wasn't perfect but was real. The room seemed to hold its breath as the officiant declared them husband and wife. Clara's heart raced as Daniel gently lifted her veil, his hand cupping her face with tenderness and reverence. Their lips met in a kiss that felt like everything, like the past, the present, and the future all converging in that one perfect moment. As the applause filled the air, Clara and Daniel stood together hand in hand, ready to face whatever life had in store for them. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would be bumps, twists, and turns that they couldn't predict. But Clara knew as they walked out of the ballroom together, their hands still intertwined, that they were no longer two people trying to fit into separate worlds. They were a team united by the love that had transformed them both. And as they walked into their future, their love story was no longer just a fairy tale. It was their reality, perfect in its imperfections, beautiful in its authenticity, and a promise forever. If you enjoyed this journey with Clara and Daniel, don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts. Their love story is only just beginning. What happens next will be even more exciting. Stay tuned for more.